I never expected to be humiliated at my own brother's wedding reception. It happened in an instant. A small moment that shattered years of delicate silence. My brother mocked me in front of everyone. He said, "She just does office work. She doesn't hold any real position." Then, his fiancée, Camden, turned to me and asked, "So, what do you actually do?" I answered with a single word. The entire room fell silent. Our parents went pale. And in that moment, she knew exactly who I was. The sun in Scottsdale, Arizona, was bright and unyielding, even in the late afternoon. It cast long, sharp shadows across the lush green of the golf course, transforming the reception area into a scene of effortless, curated luxury. Everything about Ian's wedding day was designed for spectacle. The towering floral arrangements, the live jazz band playing soft standards, the servers moving with balletic grace between guests who wore thousands of dollars in designer silk. It was a production, and Ian, my older brother, was the star. He always had been. I stood slightly apart, a flute of champagne cooling my palm, watching the scene unfold. I was in a dress I'd chosen to be elegant, yet forgettable, designed to blend into the tasteful periphery. I was Rhonda Bennett, the accommodating sister, the one who handled office stuff, the one whose achievements never warranted a space on the family's trophy wall. This was the role I had chosen, or rather, the role I had allowed them to assign me years ago. It was my armor of silence. The pattern was ancient, beginning long before a Silicon Valley seed round, or a 9-figure valuation. I vividly remembered sitting in our dining room in Phoenix, perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, trying to mention the $2 million seed funding for my fledgling AI company. I waited for a lull in the conversation, a small window of opportunity, and when it finally came, I spoke. Mom smiled politely, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "That's nice, honey," before immediately pivoting to ask Ian about his new apartment on the Upper East Side. Dad raised his glass to my brother's upcoming share house in the Hamptons. The subject changed before my entree arrived. I realized then that my success, my true self, was a disruption they simply preferred not to manage. My presence, my genuine life, felt like an attack on the delicate balance that positioned Ian as the sole, golden child. So, I adopted the lie. Staying small and silent is an act of kindness that preserves the family's happiness and my place within it. I convinced myself that maintaining this comfortable version of me was the mature choice, the selfless choice. Now, years later, flying in for the wedding only 12 hours before the ceremony, I was back in that familiar space. The moment I arrived, Mom handed me a clipboard and asked me to double-check the seating chart. Dad pointed out an issue with the sound system. Ian, from his groom's suite, texted, "Hey, can you make sure the playlist transitions are smooth for the processional?" No question about whether I had flown in from the Bay Area the night before, or if I wanted a moment to change out of my travel clothes. It was simply understood that I would handle the logistics, the competent, background support staff. Years of organizing company off-sites for hundreds of people, and negotiating international contracts had made these tasks second nature, things I could execute flawlessly while still fighting jet lag. I was useful, but fundamentally, I was unseen. When the reception began, Ian gathered his corporate friends for a photo, his arm tightening around my shoulder for a sibling shot. This was the moment of the inciting incident, the final, unforgivable nudge. He faced his colleagues, grinned, and delivered the line, loud enough for a cluster of guests to hear. "And this is Rhonda, my little sister, still just an office worker." Nothing impressive in terms of position or anything. The polite chuckles were the worst part. The acknowledgement that this was an agreed upon truth. A few sympathetic smiles suggested they finally understood why Ian was the star and I was just there. But then Camden, his new wife, didn't laugh. She watched me, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something sharper, like an equation that didn't balance. She set her glass down, turned her full attention to me, and asked, "So, what do you actually do?" In that millisecond, years of suppressed exhaustion and resentment coalesced into a single, quiet resolve. I knew I had a choice: deflect again, maintain the lie, and keep the peace, or speak the truth and deal with the inevitable explosion. I set my champagne flute on the nearest table, met her direct gaze, and answered with the one word that encapsulated my life: CEO. The room froze, the sound of ice in glasses, the low thrum of the jazz band, the background chatter. It all evaporated. I watched every eye snap to me. My parents, across the room, looked across the lawn and went visibly pale, the realization of what that single word meant hitting them like a physical blow. And Camden, Ian's bride, her eyes widened slightly, a flash of recognition crossing her face that made it chillingly clear she knew exactly who I was. The armor of silence had finally cracked. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The casual dismissal was over, and the confrontation was just beginning. The one word, CEO, hung in the air for a breath too long, sharp and undeniable against the soft jazz that had resumed playing obliviously in the distance. I had finally chosen truth over comfort, and the immediate silence was more satisfying and terrifying than any applause. I watched Ian's face. His initial expression of easy, superior amusement, the kind he reserved for family anecdotes, vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. He was ready to dismiss it, to force a chuckle and steer the conversation back to his latest high-stakes deal, just as he always did. But before he could speak, Camden, whose subtle but persistent curiosity had prompted the revelation, leaned in slightly. She was the only person at the table who was still genuinely composed, though her eyes were narrowed in deep contemplation. She was running a mental calculation, testing the name she now knew against the face of the woman Ian had just publicly dismissed. "I see," she murmured, "the AI company. That's why you were so intense on the IP terms during the due diligence process 2 years ago." She didn't press, didn't accuse. She simply stated an observed fact, which somehow made the atmosphere around our table feel heavier. I offered only a slight nod. It was enough. Camden was looking for a connection, for an explanation for the cognitive dissonance Ian had created. She had found it. Ian recovered quickly, resorting to the familiar script of deflection. "Come on, everyone, we are at a wedding. Rhonda has a great job, very steady hours. We are all really proud, but right now, we're talking about Amalfi Coast villas and hopefully no email for 10 days. He waved his hand dismissively, his voice a shade too loud, trying to force the polite chuckles back into existence. A few nervous guests obliged, hoping for an easy out. But the moment of easy deflection had passed. The real struggle wasn't the external fight, but the internal one. My cousin, Spencer, Ian's age, had grown up witnessing this dynamic firsthand. Spencer was the family's quiet strategist, always prioritizing harmony. Just an hour before the wedding began, she had pulled me aside near the bar. "Look," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "I saw the Forbes profile. I know what you've built. But today, please, keep the peace. They're not ready to hear it. And it will just create tension. No one needs on a day like this. You know how Mom and Dad feel overshadowed." Spencer's advice always sounded like quiet loyalty to the family unit. Her words were gentle, protective, and reinforced the lie that my silence was kindness. Yet, as Ian's dismissive voice echoed, and I watched the shame creep into my parents' eyes, I could almost hear Kendall, my co-founder and closest friend, shouting in my ear from Seattle. Kendall was the unapologetic voice of my professional life. She hated the version of me that appeared at family gatherings. We had talked about this dynamic on marathon phone calls after I had flown home from countless board meetings. "You're letting them define you," she had yelled 2 months ago during a preparation call. "You let them believe you're running SpongeBob's tiny briefcase company, while the rest of the world sees the woman rewriting enterprise AI. It's not fair to you, Rhonda. Force them to acknowledge it. Stop shrinking to fit their comfort zone." Kendall saw my silence not as kindness, but as self-betrayal. She pushed for truth, believing it was the only path to genuine respect. This internal conflict, the push-pull between Spencer's plea for peace and Kendall's demand for authenticity, had been my secret battle for years. Spencer's path was safe, familiar, leading down the route of least resistance. Kendall's path was terrifying, leading straight into the eye of the family storm. Standing there, at the wedding reception, watching Ian try to wipe the truth away with a cheap joke, I finally realized that my loyalty to the family's comfort had simply enabled their delusion. Their version of me wasn't protection. It was ears supremacy. I met Camden's steady gaze across the table. Her question hung in the air, "So, what do you actually do?" And now that I had answered, the choice was made. I had shattered the lie. Ian, sensing the mood had not returned to normal, quickly steered the conversation away from me entirely. He began a loud, confident monologue about his honeymoon plans. The Amalfi Coast villa, the private yacht charter, describing the expenditure and exclusivity in painstaking detail. The guests latched onto the familiar topic. Questions about itineraries, restaurants, and travel stories creating a low, protective hum of distraction. I watched Ian shine, accepting his role as the center of the orbit, and understood that even if I had kept quiet, even if I had maintained the lie, this cycle of being invisible and belittled would never have ended. My brief moment of honesty felt like the first breath I had taken in years, followed by the terrifying realization of the chaos it was about to unleash. I chose to stay silent again, but this time, it was not avoidance. It was observation. I was done reacting. I was waiting for the perfect moment to allow the full weight of the truth to land. The ceremony was over. The guests were settling in. The stage was set. I had spoken the word, CEO, shattering the fragile peace. But Ian's immediate and forceful distraction had successfully postponed the fallout. Now, as the crowd transitioned from the cocktail hour to the seated dinner reception area. I focused on the ritualistic comfort of my assigned role. The periphery. The walk across the manicured lawn felt like traversing a stage, and every detail of the setting reinforced the narrative Ian had so carefully constructed. The long tables were arranged to maximize the stunning desert mountain views, providing a backdrop that spoke of limitless wealth and effortless influence. This opulence wasn't just aesthetic. It was an extension of Ian's self-worth, and implicitly, it was meant to diminish anything that didn't shine as brightly. Like a mere office worker, I took my seat toward the edge of the large family table. From my vantage point, I could watch the entire production, feeling the familiar mix of detachment and quiet resentment. Ian, in his tailored tuxedo, sat beaming at the head of the table next to Camden. Their spot was the gravitational center of the event, the sun around which all the guests orbited. My parents were nearby, their faces still etched with the slight alarm from my earlier one-word statement, but they quickly masked it, choosing to believe Ian's forced joke. They were so practiced at protecting their son's spotlight that their own momentary shock had been overridden by decades of habit. As the first course was served, plates of seared scallops with citrus reduction, the aroma mixing with the cooling evening air, the talk instantly centered on Ian's professional life. His finance colleagues, a sharp, impeccably dressed group, were eager to recount his triumphs. "I heard about the San Francisco tech client you landed last quarter," one of them said, leaning in. "A major win. Must have been a massive fee." Ian accepted the compliment with a modest head tilt that fooled no one. It was a tricky negotiation. High stakes, high reward. That's why we do it, right? The thrill of the close. He spent the next 20 minutes recounting the details, structuring the tale like a cinematic thriller, complete with last-minute saves and heroic risk management. Every closed deal, every projected bonus, served as a proof point of his supreme competence. I listened, silently comparing his self-aggrandizing monologue to the genuine, low-key chaos of my own recent life, closing a Series C round, negotiating an acquisition in Europe, dealing with a security breach at 3 a.m. None of my achievements had a neat Hollywood narrative like Ian's. They were messy, technical, and frankly, too complex for our family to grasp, which made them easy to dismiss. During a slight lull, one of Ian's banking friends, a man I'd never met, turned to me with an avuncular smile. "And you, Rhonda. I hear you keep the home fires burning with the office stuff. Someone needs the steady hours, right? A good counterbalance." I smiled faintly, resisting the urge to mention that my office stuff involved managing a global workforce of over 500 people and an infrastructure that handled billions of transactions annually. Instead, I offered a vague, non-committal answer about being busy with work. "Nothing new," I said, lifting my glass. The phrase was so automatic, so ingrained, that it felt like a costume I could slip into instantly. He accepted it easily, turning back to Ian to ask about the market's volatility. The interaction was a perfect illustration of my life here. Ian's reality demanded inquiry, respect, and awe. Mine demanded only polite closure so they could return to the important person. Camden, however, was still observing. I caught her eye again as she picked up her water glass. She had a keen, analytical look. The look of someone who had built a startup and understood the difference between real scale and paper success. Earlier, she had mentioned knowing a few people in tech from her entrepreneurial days, a hint that she sensed the discrepancy. I wondered what she remembered about the CEO who acquired her company. Did she recall the name? The face? Or was I just another relentless, hard, bargaining executive in a neutral San Francisco boardroom? I knew she had recognized the company name from my earlier one-word statement. But the connection to Ian's meek little sister was the gap she couldn't yet bridge. I had to assume she was spending this entire dinner service connecting those dots. The ruthless negotiator across the boardroom table, and the quiet girl who checked the microphone batteries. The sun dipped lower, and the string lights above the table flickered on, casting a golden hue over the remaining guests. The atmosphere was ripe with false intimacy and easy laughter, a world Ian had built and mastered. I felt the dull, familiar sting of the lie, which was more exhausting than any 16-hour board meeting. My only goal now was to remain silent, to fade into the decorative background until the cake was cut and the evening ended. But I also knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in my stomach, that I would not deflect again. The stage had been set, the actors were in place, and the confrontation I had avoided for years was now inevitable. Ian had just provided the final, fatal cue. Dinner was being served, and the real show was about to begin. The entree plates, perfectly seared scallops, were cleared, and the servers began placing the main courses, slices of carved prime rib and generous portions of herb-crusted salmon. The aroma of rich food mingled with the growing tension, creating a strange, heavy mix of decadence and dread. My goal in this scene was simple: survive the dinner hour without having to engage in any substantive personal conversation. But the escalating atmosphere and Ian's mounting ego made that impossible. The evening was now entering the phase of high emotionality and high alcohol consumption. Toasts began informally. Friends standing up to share funny anecdotes that inevitably turned into tributes to Ian's perceived brilliance. Glasses clinked repeatedly. Ian, buoyed by the admiration, and perhaps 2 or 3 glasses of expensive Cabernet, decided the moment was ripe for another family anecdote. He stood up near the head of the table, tapping his fork lightly against his glass, his smile wide and radiating the confidence of a man entirely comfortable with his place in the universe. He thanked everyone again, spoke warmly about Camden, then pivoted to a light aside about family dynamics. This was the pressure point, the routine he had performed 100 times before. "It's truly wonderful to have so many accomplished people here," he announced, his voice carrying clearly down the long table. "Especially when you have to balance the high-stakes risk of my world. Finance, N&A, the constant grind, with the more grounded realities of life. It's nice to have someone like my sister, Rhonda, handling the ordinary office duties, the steady work. It keeps our parents from worrying too much, and it leaves me free to chase the big deals that really move the needle." The comment landed softly, intended as an inside joke, the kind of light tease family accepts without question. A few nervous chuckles rippled down the table, acknowledging the status difference Ian had just underlined. He was still clinging to the narrative that my life was small, safe, and necessary only as a foil to his own glittering, high-risk existence. I felt the heat rising in my chest, not the fiery anger I used to feel, but a slow, quiet burn of exhaustion. The fatigue of constantly having to swallow my life story to protect their carefully constructed worldview was overwhelming. Camden, however, was not laughing. I watched her set her fork down with meticulous care. Her attention was fully on me now, and the look in her eyes was no longer simple curiosity, it was a definite recognition, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. She was a founder, she had been acquired, she was at the center of the story. She had done the math. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and direct, cutting cleanly through the nervous chuckles Ian had elicited. Rhonda. She repeated my name, testing it out. You said CEO earlier. What company exactly? Ian frowned, an expression of genuine annoyance that his joke had been derailed. He started to wave her off. Camden, honey, it's not really the time. But Camden ignored him. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, waiting. And that was it. After all the years of self-censorship, of prioritizing their comfort, of carrying the lie, Ian's final, arrogant dismissal had finally pushed me past the point of return. I had nothing left to lose by telling the truth, and everything to lose by returning to the silence. The weight of years settled in my shoulders, and I felt the strength of Kendall's voice urging me on. Stop shrinking to fit their comfort zone. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and met Camden's gaze. I didn't raise my voice, didn't create drama, but ensured my words were heard by everyone at the table. The AI company that acquired your startup 2 years ago. I stated evenly. The statement was not a boast, but a fact. Delivered with the quiet, terminal finality of a business memo. Ian's jaw dropped slightly. He was still trying to fit the vast, complex, multi-million-dollar reality of my professional life into his preferred simple, domestic narrative. He sputtered. An inarticulate sound of disbelief, looking around the table for someone to confirm this was the punchline to a very bad joke. But the eyes around the table were fixed on Camden. She was the one with the knowledge, the one who could verify the claim. Camden did not disappoint. She slowly pushed her main course plate away, creating a sharp, scraping sound on the linen that was amplified 100 times in the quiet. Her expression was one of intense, clinical clarity. The face of a CEO realizing she's been sitting next to her major competitor's relative for an entire afternoon. She then repeated the full company name, slowly, as if testing the syllables aloud. The one that bought us out for $48 million, with the earn-out clause tied to the user growth milestones. The sound of the specific dollar amount struck the table with physical force. $48 million. A number that dwarfed the cost of Ian's wedding, and certainly overshadowed any of the routine, smaller bonuses he was used to bragging about. It was a verifiable fact, delivered by a primary source, his own bride. A wave of confusion spread across the faces of Ian's friends. This wasn't a small side project, this was serious capital. Camden continued. Her voice measured, but completely steady. She wasn't performing, she was processing a profound violation of trust. I remember the final negotiation meeting, in your San Francisco office. You pushed hard on the intellectual property terms, Rhonda. You wanted full control of the core algorithm we'd spent 3 years building. She turned slightly, addressing the table, but looking straight at Ian's shocked colleagues, lending the story professional credibility. We walked out of that meeting, thinking we'd lost everything, thinking the terms were too harsh. Then the revised offer came in 2 days later, with better protections for the team, which is what we ultimately accepted. The picture she was painting was one of high-stakes corporate warfare, of a ruthless, precise, and highly successful businesswoman, a picture that fundamentally invalidated the office worker Ian had presented. Your team then pivoted the product, integrated it with enterprise tools, scaled it globally. Camden concluded, her eyes finally finding mine again. I followed the news. I just never connected Rhonda Bennett, Ian's little sister, to the founder who outmaneuvered us. The silence that followed was heavy and complete. It was the silence of shared, communal shock. No one chewed. Forks rested on plates. Even the distant jazz band seemed too loud, too cheerful for the disaster happening at our table. My parents were frozen, staring first at Camden, then at me. Mom's hand was halfway to her water glass, suspended in disbelief. Dad's mouth opened slightly, then closed, his usual confident posture deflating under the weight of the facts. The reality hit them, the cumulative realization of all the vague phone calls I'd taken, the excused absences from holidays, the strange exhaustion I carried, not from sorting files, but from running a successful company. Ian finally found his voice, forcing a short, sharp laugh that sounded completely hollow. Come on, everyone. She's joking. Classic Rhonda humor. You know how she is. Always setting us up. He tried to wave it away dismissively, scanning the table for agreement. For anyone to grant him the easy escape he always expected. But no one chuckled nervously this time. They simply looked down. Uncomfortable witnesses, trapped in a moment they hadn't signed up for. Ian's expression hardened just a fraction. The mask of easy confidence cracking to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. Seriously, though, he demanded, his voice rising. Why hold back all this time? You waited until my wedding day to drop this kind of news. That's convenient timing if you ask me. The accusation landed sharply, a desperate attempt to regain control by shifting the blame. He was no longer defending the family lie, he was attacking the timing of the truth, revealing that he understood its power perfectly. Camden remained quiet beside him, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. She didn't defend Ian, didn't contradict me, but she added one more, crushing detail in a measured tone. The due diligence process was intense. Your legal team went through every line of code we'd written. Her words cemented the moment. Ian's forced laugh was gone. His face flushed a deeper red. The full weight of the truth. That his own wife had lost her company to his sister. The sister he dismissed as a clerk. Had finally connected the dots, destroying his carefully constructed life story. He looked around for support one last time, saw only averted gazes and silence, and the forced smile disappeared entirely. The climax was set, and the only logical step left was the exit. Ian's attempt to dismiss the revelation as a joke had failed. His attempt to label it as an act of revenge had landed flat. The combination of the $48 million figure and Camden's meticulous Factual recall had established an undeniable truth. The weight of the moment was now fully settled. And the silence surrounding the table was a tangible thing, charged with years of unspoken resentment and ignored achievement. My parents, however, were still struggling to reconcile the office worker with the founder who acquired our daughter-in-law. Mom set her napkin down carefully, her brow furrowed with confusion that was rapidly turning to regret. "Wait," she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're saying this is actually true?" She looked at me, searching for confirmation, for some signal that this was a misunderstanding or a business exaggeration. I simply held her gaze and nodded once. Dad leaned forward, his half-empty glass of wine forgotten in his hand. The reality of the situation was eroding his confident stance, chipping away at the foundation of his favored narrative. "Those trips you took, always work conferences. The vague calls you took outside the house. That was all for this company." Another nod. The pieces were connecting for them, visibly and agonizingly. Mom's eyes darted as she rapidly recalled every time I had politely excused myself from a family dinner for an urgent call. Every casual dismissal of my travel as simply being on the road for meetings. Dad's face shifted from confusion to something heavier, something close to sorrowful regret. His shoulders slumped slightly, with thought. "We just assumed." He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence that would have included the word, Ian. They had assumed, year after year. Because assumption was easier than asking, and because their assumption had kept Ian happy. The guests shifted uncomfortably, cousins twisting their napkins in their laps. They were not active participants in the lie, but they were certainly beneficiaries of the peace it bought. Now, they were trapped in the middle of a private war. My focus remained entirely on Ian. He was witnessing the collapse of his entire framework. The spotlight he had monopolized for decades was finally shining on the reality he had suppressed. And that reality was now proving to be an existential threat to his ego. He tried one last time to regain control, his voice rising with a frantic edge of frustration. "Look, if this is real, great, congratulations, but pulling it out now. In front of everyone, on my day." He glanced desperately around for support, for anyone to validate his sense of being wronged. But eyes stayed down. Forks remained idle. The consensus was clear. The timing may have been inconvenient, but the lie was the real offense. Camden placed a hand flat on the table, not quite touching Ian's arm. That subtle lack of support hit him the hardest. The one person who was supposed to be his ally in this new family unit was standing firm on the side of factual honesty. Her silence spoke volumes, confirming that she valued the integrity of the truth over his immediate comfort. Ian's cheeks flushed deeper. The last vestiges of the forced smile vanished entirely. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the sharp, scraping sound loud and abrasive in the quiet atmosphere. He stood, reaching for Camden's hand. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice thick with unspent anger and humiliation. Camden rose without resistance. Her expression was unreadable, perhaps disappointed, perhaps simply exhausted by the charade. They walked away from the table together, not toward the dance floor or the bar, but toward the private patio area beyond the reception lights. There were no excuses, no forced goodbyes, just steady, retreating steps. The remaining guests watched them go, the heavy silence stretching longer, punctuated only by the faint, oblivious sound of the band setting up again in the distance. The dinner was effectively over. A server approached with the main course plates, sensed the tension, and quietly retreated. Chairs slowly emptied as people drifted towards safer, distant conversations on the grounds. At our table, Mom stared at her hands. Dad rubbed his temple. And the weight of missed opportunities and years of willful blindness hung thicker than the cool desert night air. The lie was dead, and its death was messy, public, and permanent. I had faced my ghost, and now I had to face the consequence of my choice. The reception ended quietly that night, less a celebration and more a staggered retreat. After Ian and Camden walked away, the life seemed to drain out of the event. Guests who had laughed and clinked glasses hours before now slipped away earlier than planned, exchanging hushed comments and careful nods. It felt less like a wedding finale and more like a company merger that had gone hostile. I didn't linger. I slipped out into the cooling desert air, the sound of the string lights buzzing slightly overhead, and took a red-eye flight back to San Francisco. The flight was a period of deliberate, restorative silence, finally free of the expectation that I had to perform the role of the lesser sibling. Back in my sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking the bay, the silence broke the next morning, not with a bang, but with the rapid, insistent chatter of my phone. The screen lit up with missed calls and a flood of texts from my parents. They were clumsy, even on screen, riddled with ellipses and awkward apologies. Rhonda, please call. We are so sorry for not asking more. We realize we assumed too much. We promise to talk whenever you are ready. The messages were laced with guilt, fear, and a terrifying eagerness to fix the damage which, ironically, only underscored their long-standing avoidance of anything difficult. I read them, felt the familiar, toxic pull of guilt, mixed with profound exhaustion, and left them unanswered. I knew that answering now would only drag me back into the negotiation of my own worth. Word, as it always does in the tightly woven world of high finance and tech, traveled in overlapping circles. The story of the wedding dinner, the public humiliation, the multi-million-dollar acquisition reveal, the dramatic exit, was too rich to stay private. A guest at the reception who worked in banking had casually mentioned the family tension to a colleague who happened to be connected to one of Ian's potential clients. The details weren't malicious gossip, they were just context. But in Ian's world, where reputation is currency and confidence is a commodity, character counts beyond balance sheets. A week later, Ian lost the contract. A major deal. One that would have been a career highlight and solidified his managing director track. The client cited alignment issues and concerns about integrity in handling external pressures. Nothing explicit about me. But the message was clear. Ian's public display of arrogance and subsequent loss of control suggested a fragility that the client was unwilling to risk millions on. The financial consequence was severe, a sudden, sharp price tag placed on his years of familial entitlement. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Camden canceled their honeymoon plans shortly after. I learned this secondhand through Kendall, who was friends with one of Camden's old co-founders. Camden had confided that she needed space to think. The issue wasn't just the shock of the reveal. The incident had forced her to re-examine all the patterns she had overlooked before the wedding. Ian's casual dismissals, the way he positioned himself above everyone, the constant need for validation. The lie I had carried for years was less damaging to me than the exposure of Ian's need. For that lie was to him. The Amalfi Coast villa booking was refunded. The time off work was repurposed for reflection instead of celebration. The extravagant trip, meant to be the capstone of Ian's supreme status, became the symbol of its abrupt failure. Spencer checked in regularly, her messages full of quiet solidarity. She was the only one who truly understood the family's side, the fear of change, the ingrained habit of protecting the image. She reminded me that boundaries weren't cruelty, they were survival. You don't owe them immediate forgiveness, Rhonda, she wrote. You have to protect your peace now. Kendall, naturally, was more direct, celebrating the situation as long overdue freedom. You finally stopped carrying their version of you. That's power. They had to learn the hard way that you are not a supporting character in their play. I made the break official. I blocked my parents and Ian's numbers. I declined the generic emails arriving for the upcoming holiday gatherings. There were no dramatic announcements, just silence on my end. A powerful, permanent quiet. The reception had been the climax. But this was the reckoning. I used to believe that staying quiet protected everyone, kept the family intact, avoided conflict, and let Ian keep his shine. But I realized that my silence only preserved their convenience, not our connection. Cutting ties wasn't revenge. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. It was the only way to heal the deep wound of being unseen. I had given them the chance to see me, and their inability to accept it was a consequence they had to own. The air finally felt clean. The first few weeks after the wedding, and the subsequent silence felt strange, like missing a limb I hadn't realized was weighing me down. I was so accustomed to the constant mental rehearsal. The planning, the calculating of how to downplay an achievement. The drafting of texts that I would immediately delete. That the sudden vacuum was disorienting. It was the feeling of a motor shutting off after running for 20 years straight. Then, the strangeness faded. Work filled the space effortlessly, naturally. Board meetings, product launches, mentoring younger engineers. Life in the Bay Area moved at its usual intense, satisfying pace. My time was mine again, dedicated only to the things that built me up, not the obligations that tore me down. The relief came gradually, then all at once, washing over me one Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee on my balcony. I looked out over the city, the soft fog lifting over the skyscrapers, and realized I felt no dread about the upcoming holidays. No pressure to fly east. No need to armor myself for the inevitable onslaught of dismissive pleasantries. The constant, subtle background hum of obligation had quieted, replaced by a clarity I hadn't known I was missing. I used to believe the lie that staying quiet protected everyone, kept the family intact, avoided conflict, and preserved my position, however small, within their orbit. But I finally understood the devastating flaw in that thinking. My silence didn't protect the connection, it preserved their convenience. It taught them how little of me they needed to see to feel comfortable. It was a transaction where I paid with my authenticity, and they paid with their willful blindness. Cutting ties wasn't easy, and it wasn't revenge, despite Ian's frantic accusations. It was the establishment of boundaries. It was the necessary, final choice of self-respect over forced, corrosive harmony. The wound I had carried for years, the feeling of being unseen and unwelcome, finally began to close. I had internalized the belief that my authentic self was too disruptive, too much for the people who claimed to love me. The only way to prove that belief wrong was to step fully into my power, even if that meant stepping away from them. Kendall's texts, blunt and affirming, provided the necessary mirror. She saw the freedom I had gained. Spencer's quieter influence remained too, reminding me that even though family was important, survival was paramount. The greatest lesson was this: I had spent years auditioning for the approval of people who never truly watched the performance. I waited for them to notice the Forbes articles, the IPO, the valuation that dwarfed Ian's entire career. I waited for the nod, the honest question, the moment of pride. And when it finally arrived, forced by an external catalyst, Camden, it brought not reconciliation, but confrontation. They rejected the reality because it challenged the comfortable fantasy they had curated. So, I chose silence again. But this time, it was my own. It was a firm, self-aware boundary, not a desperate plea for peace. You don't owe anyone a smaller version of yourself. Not family, not colleagues, not anyone. The healthiest thing you can do is stop shrinking to fit spaces that were never built for your full size. Real peace comes when you stop auditioning and simply begin living the life that deserves to be seen. I had found my oxygen, and it had nothing to do with their approval.